The Man of God Network exists to help the church in her mission to identify and equip qualified, faithful men for the gospel ministry and for the recovery of biblical reformation in our day. It's our joy to provide you with resources that both encourage you and edify you as you seek to build Christ Church where you are, to the end that He is better known, loved, and exalted. We appreciate the support of our listeners. To learn more about how you can help us accomplish our mission, visit manofgodnetwork.com.
The Covenant Podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective.
We pray you find this resource edifying, faithful to Scripture, and Christ exalting. Now, let's get started. Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. Austin McCormick here, and I have the privilege to speak with Dr. Burns today, and the topic of our conversation is going to be Adoniram Judson. So, Dr. Burns, welcome to the Covenant Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here, Austin.
Yeah, we're excited to have this conversation. At the Covenant Podcast, we are especially interested in Baptist history, and Adoniram Judson is someone that we have not had an episode on yet, so we're really excited to have you on to talk about him and how the Lord used him. But before we get into talking about his life, can you just begin our conversation by introducing yourself to our audience by sharing any information that you would like to?
Yeah, so I've been involved in missions for about 20 years, and I've worked all over the world. Teaching pastors and training missionaries has been the longest emphasis of my ministry, but not the only or even the main emphasis. A lot of the work I've done has been in theological resource development and translation work, which I do in a variety of different languages with different Hill Tribes people. And the ministry I have is actually quite unique in the sense that it's based in Alaska, and I'm the president of an organization that works with Bush Natives. And so that's a pretty seasonal ministry. And when we can't see where we're going in the summer times, which is, most of the year in Alaska is kind of winter. And I spend the school year in Southeast Asia, where I teach at a seminary there. And in the summers, my family and I are here in Alaska. This is where I'm at the moment. We head back to Thailand in about 2 months or so. And I teach from a seminary there to a bunch of satellite schools all over Southeast Asia. And I've been doing that for about 20 years. And being a missionary it's a hard and it's a happy life. And I can't imagine doing anything else.
Wow. Really grateful to hear about yourself and how the Lord has seen fit to use you during this season. And we do want to talk about missionary, specifically Adoniram Judson, and perhaps the interest that you have in studying him. So perhaps as a follow-up question, can you just tell us about why you are interested in Adoniram Judson?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when you kind of go back and look at the Lord's, fingerprints of providence in your life, things become clearer as you have more distance from them. And I remember when I was back in 2003, I was going through a really difficult time in life, some just seasons of deep discouragement, maybe even depression. And it was the story of Adoniram Judson that the Lord used to kind of break me through some of that. Mercifully, just hearing of the testimony of God's faithfulness and providence and kindness and strength to sustain Adoniram Judson through immense adversity and immense suffering and even depression and suicidal ideation even. And it was through the testimony of God's grace in his life that God indelibly stamped this great example of a man who just trusted in the Lord. And there was always a dear place in my heart for Adoniram Judson. And when I did my PhD work, I was essentially doing two different PhDs that I integrated into a concentrated integrated program. And I decided to, it was a missions and a spirituality, two different programs that I decided to do a really, really intense dissertation. And I had wanted to study Andrew Fuller. That was what I came in the program to do, was to study his missionary theology and to write on that. But through a providential conversation with a fellow PhD colleague, he said, well, you work with Burmese people. Most of your teachings in Burma, you live all over these hill tribes people. Have you ever thought about Adoniram Judson? And I thought, well, I mean, he's one of my heroes and he's inspired me for so many years, but I never thought about kind of digging up his life. And so the Lord, through multiple unique providences, he led me to do my PhD research on Jetson. And what I discovered was that there was multiple volumes of biographies written about him, and his story is fabulous. It combines romance and adventure and thrill and mystery and everything that goes into a really dynamic story. It's really there in his life story. And multiple biographies have been written about him and still sell because it's such a fascinating story. But nobody had ever gotten underneath the surface, kind of checked the hood, so to speak, and looked at the engine. What drove Adoniram Judson? And I mean, I started doing digging and realized nobody had done that. And I thought, sign me up. And I was perfectly placed in Burma, working with Burmese people, I had boots on the ground, so to speak, and was able to unearth some of his writings that nobody even knew were in existence, and translated them into English, and have gone through everything by him, about him, and everything, just the whole corpus and then some. And so yeah, it was a fabulous study, and he changed my life in so many ways.
That's really encouraging to hear, and glad that you've been able to profit from his story, and glad the Lord used him to benefit you during that season that you mentioned. But in light of the research that you've spent on Adoniram Judson now, we want to ask you if you would give our audience a biographical sketch of Adoniram Judson. And in your sketch, if you wouldn't mind, would you include the detail of how Judson became a Baptist?
Sure. Yeah. So he was born in 1788, August 9th, and he was born to a preacher named Adoniram Judson Sr., and he was of the Puritan ilk. He'd trained under the Jonathan Edwards School of the Prophets, as they used to call it, and that was a very discipleship-oriented, non-formal pastoral training program. And so he was very Puritan, very Edwardsian in his theology. And Judson Jr., Adoniram Jr., grew up in that. He was a skilled linguist from a young age. And to be fair, most children were, they were fluent at some level in different languages in that era anyways. But he'd been reading Cicero in Latin from a very young age. He had a mind for linguistics. His dad went on a preaching trip, and a week later came back, and Adoniram Jr. had memorized one of the Psalms as a young boy, like 6 years old, and he was just very inquisitive, a very inquisitive child. But he grew up an unbeliever, living the life of a Christian in the home of a Congregationalist pastor. Went to Brown University, and he was a deist. There was they called it French infidelism back in the day, and it was deism essentially. And he was valedictorian. He graduated, gave a very robust deistic manifesto at his Brown graduation, and he wanted to go off to theater. He went to New York, and he and some friends traveled the countryside, and they wanted to write for theater. They just were living kind of the kind of a very pagan lifestyle for those days, and just living like unbelievers, living like secularists to the core. And his one of his friends, roommate at Brown, was Jacob Eames, or some people say Jacob Ames, and he was a deist. He was essentially the guy that kind of converted Judson to official deism back in the day. And he had been visiting his uncle Ephraim in Western Massachusetts, and Ephraim was essentially a Puritan pastor of the Edwardian ilk. And he went to his uncle's house, and what's just fascinating about this is history doesn't record this man's name, but in Judson's biography, he describes this. It was one of the pastoral candidates who was living with his uncle Ephraim. Ephraim wasn't there, and so Judson had stayed at his uncle's house, and he discusses this young man's piety and pathos for God. And there was something about the way this young man spoke about his relationship to the Lord that dominated Judson's conscience for a couple days. And Judson rode into the wilderness after his time at Uncle Ephraim's house with this young man. Again, no name, nobody has any clue who this person was, but made an indelible mark on Judson's soul. And then he runs into some bad weather, ends up in a little inn, a little hotel. And anybody who knows the story of Judson knows this part. This is a very pivotal time in his life. He's there in the inn, in this hotel. Essentially, the walls are very thin. It's like, having a curtain hanging between beds. It's a very, very porous wall. And there's a man on the other side of the wall who's suffering and basically dying in his sleep, and he's coughing and yelling and moaning throughout the night. And finally, the man dies early in the morning. And as Judson's checking out, he asks the innkeeper, he says, what had happened to the young man on the other side of the curtain, or the other side of the wall? He said, oh, he died. And as he's walking out and he's crossing the threshold out of the inn, he turns around and asks his name. He says, do you know who he was? Does he have any family around? And the guy said, yeah, he was a young man. He just recently graduated from Brown University. I believe his name was Jacob Eames. And Jetson he notes in his story, he was thunderstruck that his deistic friend, who had essentially assaulted him with deistic, proselytization for the years he was at Brown, had died a violent death, and he was there to hear him pass into the unknown. And Judson was completely rocked by this, and he had a long horse ride to his next destination, and there was just, the Lord was at work in his soul, and he decided to enroll at Andover Seminary, a brand new seminary started by some men in the Boston area. And he was one of the first enrollees in the seminary, and he became a believer his first semester at Andover. They admitted him, even though he wasn't a believer. He was so inquisitive, and he was so good with languages. He's so good. He was such a good scholar at a young age that they thought they would make a provision for him, that maybe he would come around. And he did indeed come around. God gripped his heart, and he buddied up with some of the guys from the Haystack prayer meeting in 1804. They became friends at Andover, and he was influenced towards missions there at Andover, and received deep discipleship by many of the professors, and they were very evangelism oriented in their theology. They a very warm-hearted Calvinism, an evangelical Calvinism, kind of, as Lloyd Jones would call, like logic on fire. That was their pathos as men in training for missions. And one of the really unique things about Judson was he was considered to be one of the most gifted orators they'd ever seen. The pastors, the professors had ever seen, and he was offered the most prestigious pulpit in Boston at the time. And they thought he'd be like the next George Whitefield. Very, very dynamic, very gifted, talented speaker. And he turned it down to become a missionary. And he was essentially chided by his family. His dad was not terribly pleased with him. But Jetson had a burning desire to get the gospel to the unreached, and particularly in Burma. There was no missions program to send him, so he actually went over to the London Baptist Society and visited with Andrew Fuller to look into getting support initially from London, but it didn't work out. And funny story along the way, he was the ship he was on was commandeered by one of Napoleon's fleets, and he was thrown in prison in France. And the only way he got out was that he spoke Latin, and he kind of made friends with one of the prison guards. And Judson, even as he was writing, going back to the States to raise support, he said, maybe this is preparing me for the sufferings to come as a missionary, as prison life. And part of God's providence in his life is he gets to India, he he works with William Carey for a short season, and there's no hope to get to Burma. They're looking at Penang, which is in Malaysia, and a couple other places. But then a ship just shows up, and he and his then wife Anne, they marry, and then like 2 days later they go on the mission field. He and his wife Anne jump on a ship to Burma, end up in Burma, and they serve there for multiple years. And Anne dies in 1826, and Judson had been in prison during this time because the British and the Burmese were at war, and the Burmese thought he was a British spy, and he had been in prison for approximately about 22 months, so almost 2 years, and suffered great torture. And a couple really interesting things about this moment in his life is it's a good example of the Lord providentially guiding the written word, which Judson was so committed to investing in the written word. And Judson, as I mentioned earlier, was a talented orator. He said he would say he felt called to preach, but he couldn't preach until there was a Bible. And so it's like he put his preaching gift, his preaching burden on the shelf, and what drove him as a translator was his passion to preach. And so he called it a long life of self-denial, denying himself his passion to preach so that the Bible could be translated. And so he's devoted to the written word. And while he's in prison, being tortured for approximately, like I said, almost 2 years, about 22 months or so, the Burmese soldiers have raided his house, are looking for it. Anne hides the manuscripts, the then Burmese manuscripts that he had, in the ground, and she tells him, and he says, no, but it's going to rot in the ground, so you got to put it somewhere else where they can't find it. So she wraps it in a pillow, like she puts the manuscripts inside a pillow, wraps it up, and then she puts lacquer around the pillow and makes it really hard, so it's sealed and it's kind of airtight, and no water can get in it and rot. And then she has this really hard pillow with lacquer around it, and she takes it to him, and she gives it to him, and the guards in the prison say, they kind of kick it around like a soccer ball or a football. And they said, what do these crazy foreigners want such a hard pillow for? And they said, well, we don't need it. He might as well just put his head on it. And he put his head on this hardened pillow with the manuscripts inside. And he talked about how God had preserved the sacred ark underneath the noses of the Burmese guards. And one day he's extracted from prison, and he's just taken, and he's not able to take the pillow with him. And he's completely, he feels gutted that he's just left behind all his translated works there in the prison. And his Burmese translator friend, his first convert, Mong Nao, goes to the prison a few days later to pack up some of Judson's stuff and take it to the next prison site. And he didn't find it, but on his way, he found the trash heap that the guards had thrown everything into, and he found the lacquered pillow. And he comes running back home. Judson actually had been released, and he's back. And Mung now comes running with like a football in his arms, the pillow, the Bible, and they rejoice together because there they know that all of their work is in the written word. And Judson, that's one of the keys of Judson's life, and that was actually part of the key that kind of converted him from Congregationalist to Baptist, was when he's on that voyage to India initially, he's a Congregationalist, but he's so textual minded, he's so word centered, and he's so devoted to the written word, not just the oral word, not a story, but the text itself. As he's translating, he stumbles upon the Greek word for baptism, and he says, there is no way around this. It means to immerse. It means to dunk or to dip. It can't mean sprinkle at all. And it was his commitment to Greek. He was translating the Greek into English for himself on his voyage to India, and he wrote what William Carey said was the best argument for believers' baptism he'd ever read. And saying a lot coming from Carey, who is a linguist and a theologian by his own right, very renowned. And so it's still actually quite a good read. It's an excellent argument for believers' baptism. And Judson and Ann, when they were on that voyage to India, they said, we will lose all our support as Congregationalists. We will lose our friends, because Baptists were not highly respected in those days, in the post-colonial era. It's colonial, post-colonial era. The Congregationalists were kind of the elites, and the money was with the Congregationalists, but the Baptists were outcast socially. And for Adoniram and Ann, for them, it was a huge leap of faith to trust God, to make a decision on doctrine and theology that was not expedient necessarily. It didn't guarantee social standing or financial stability, but they resolved to be obedient to the word. And it just goes to show, kind of, it's an analogy of the fiber and the doctrinal drivenness of Adoniram and Ann. And that stayed with him all his life. He was very doctrinally minded, very word centered. And like I said, Ann died in 1826, and then about 8 years later, he married Sarah Boardman, whose her husband George Boardman had also died, and she was a missionary with the Karen people. Sarah and Adoniram married in 1834. God really poured out His Spirit in 1831 after many years of suffering and agony, torture and heartache with loss of children, loss of Anne. God blessed his sufferings in 1831. People came from China and Cathay and other parts of Siam, Thailand, asking for a writing. They said, "Are you the Jesus Christ man? Give us a writing that tells us how to escape eternal hell." And his confidence was in the written word, and that was what he devoted himself to in training pastors who could preach it. And so much more could be said about examples that highlight his devotion to the written word and its doctrines. But then, Sarah dies, and he's taking Sarah back to the U.S. to get medical help, and she dies, and he buries her along the way. And he gets back to the U.S. First time he'd ever been back since he left in 1812. He comes back in 1847, meets Emily, his third soon-to-be wife, and she's a talented author, a talented writer, and she writes his story. And she pens a lot of his story, and it's thanks to her and God's providence that we know anything about him, really. And they go back to Burma. He dies in 1850. And their son dies not long after he dies, and his story is penned by her. She compiles all his notes as much as she had, at least, and then she basically interviews with Francis Wayland, who was the president of Brown University at the time, and he writes the definitive, exhaustive Judson biography. It's a 2-volume set, and pretty much every other biography is based out of Wayland's two-volume set. The best one, in my opinion, that is the best historically grounded and readable, and the most interesting to read, is Courtney Anderson's To the Golden Shore, which is written in the 50s. But of all the biographies, Anderson does the best job to combine readability, just story-like format, and historical accuracy. So if you're looking for a good book on Judson, I would recommend Courtney Anderson's To the Golden Shore. So I'm going to pause there. I know there's a long answer, but there's a lot to a story that makes it so compelling. So many more little things I could fill in, but those are the highlights that make him such a inimitable missionary.
No, that is golden stuff that we really wanted to hear about, and we're glad that you're able to give us a overview of the highlights of Adoniram's life. Especially interested in the story of the football pillow.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that with us, brother. And we do want to make some more applications out of this biographical sketch that you've given to us about Adoniram. So just to transition the conversation to our next point, we want to be more pointedly talking about evangelisms and missions. So what can Adoniram teach us about evangelism and missions?
Yeah. So in my book, A Supreme Desire to Please Him, The Spirituality of Adoniram Judson, I break up what you might call his missionary spirituality into a couple different chapters, and they all feed into his, well, let me just put it this way. Your methodology is always downstream of your theology. And somewhere in between is your spirituality. I would call your spirituality the glue that sticks together your theology and your missiology. So he didn't just do ministry. He didn't just do evangelism missions out of nowhere. And that's what my book is designed to uncover: is who was he? What did he believe? How did that affect him devotionally and spiritually? And how did all of that propel him to be the evangelist and the missions-minded person he was? So what we can learn in a snapshot from Judson, the biggest takeaways would be essentially a indomitable trust in the providence of God. And he would define that as God's sovereignty, God's wisdom, and God's benevolence. And actually, it's quite a good biblical definition of the providence of God. When you look at the Bible, the three major features of the providence of God revealed in Scripture are sovereignty, kindness or benevolence, and his wisdom. Judson would often come back to those three parts of God. So I'm going to do my best, but know that it doesn't depend upon me. And if I perish, I perish. But God will get the job done. And so part of Judson's confidence in God's electing grace to call out people from every tribe, tongue, and nation, that stabilized him to just suffer long. But the other thing that people don't realize, because a lot of people will look at the story, or they'll look at, kind of what he did as far as great feats like translating the Bible. But what was unique about that, and probably one of the most instructive things for me, was his confidence in the written word. Even the Burmese, it's what some missiologists call a redemptive analogy. Some culture, not every culture, but some cultures have little interpretive keys into the culture that you can tap into and transfer gospel meaning into their culture. And not all of them are like this, but every now and then you find one. Like in Burma, they believed that in the temple, the pagoda in the center of their towns or villages, in the temple or the pagoda was a written book, and that was supposed to kind of determine the culture and the civil life and the belief system of the people. It was the stabilizing center of each village. And Judson was devoted to get a Bible into the center of each town so that it would itself kind of evangelize that town, that people would start reading it. And Judson was so committed to what the Burmese called the golden lamp from heaven. They believed that some sacred book was like a golden lamp that, came down out of heaven, that was supposed to tell them answers to life, essentially, a philosophy of life. And what was so instructive about Judson's evangelism was his confidence in getting the written word into the hands of people. Judson was so devoted to translating the Bible and then sowing seed and getting tracts, apologetic resources into the hands of people. It's kind of like you can get a PhD in seed throwing, but it doesn't really matter because the power's in the seed. Like our job is just to indiscriminately, liberally disseminate the seed all over the ground and then sleep like God is sovereign. And Judson's, his devotion to evangelism was such that he could just sow the seed, print the Bible, print the tracts, do the work of getting the Bible into the hands of people, and know that the Bible is, as Cameron Townsend would say, the best missionary. And so Judson was very committed to the written word, and he was, in a way, he was kind of like what we might call like a presuppositionalist, not in the fullest sense, but he definitely was very text-centered, and he was always bringing people back to the written word. And he would push the Buddhist monks to, what does the text say? That was his question, is what does the text say? And he was always getting them to argue with what the written word said. And it was fabulous. And even in my work in the Buddhist world, when you're working with, Buddhist scholars, one of the best things you can do is bring them back to the text. And the Bible does its work, and you don't need to get in the way, and you don't need to help it along. Just let the Bible do its work. And Judson, for me, was incredibly instructive in bibliocentrism and text-oriented evangelism. Completely transformed my missions philosophy after studying him.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and encouraged to hear about the word-centered ministry of Adoniram Judson. Another thing that you've been alluding to in your biographical sketch of Adoniram was the abundant amount of suffering that the Lord allowed him to go through. And so initially, as I had worded this question, I wanted to talk about grieving through spousal loss, but we can open it up to other forms of suffering that Adoniram went throughout his life. So what can Adoniram teach us about grieving through various sufferings that the Lord sends our way?
Yeah, I think, he had 13 kids and 3 wives. Two of his wives he buried. The third Emily died at a young age due to compromised health from Burmese illness. And of his 13 children, 7 died, and 6 lived to live as adults. He was not the only missionary to suffer like this, but he's one of the stories we know of somebody who suffered like this. But his confidence in what I said earlier, the providence of God, the sovereignty of God over all things, absolute sovereignty, not just God's reactionary nature, but God's sovereign activity, sovereign active control over all things. And not just a distant, removed, calloused sovereign in the universe, but a loving God who works according to the wisdom of his counsel. Judson's confidence in that God who loved him, that God who is in control of all things, and that God who is infinitely wise, stabilized him to press on. And he certainly went through his own ups and downs, his own questioning. And you don't want to over psychologize it a little bit, but if you can kind of imagine being tortured without any sort of ethics at all, it wasn't like he was just held in a nice prison. He was actually tortured in prison for months and months. And so days become weeks, and weeks become months, and months become almost years of unremitting torture. And the mind tends to break down, and your adrenal glands dry up, you are dehydrated, you start to hallucinate, you are in immense pain, you come in and out of consciousness, your brain stops working. There's just so many things, physiologically speaking, that can happen to a person with so much unending trauma for so long. And so you kind of want to give him a pass for some of the things he said around that time of his life, because he was probably out of his mind. And that was part of the, you want to say, the art of Burmese torture. They had mastered kind of the art of torturing people over a very long period. It wasn't like the Romans that tortured people, for a couple of days and then killed them. They had a way of torturing people to the point of almost dying and keeping them alive for weeks and months on end. So what we can see now in retrospect was that it wasn't Judson's strength of holding on to God as much as it was God's power to hold on to Judson and to keep him in the faith through it all, and to keep him trusting in his providence. And so grieving a loss, I think the way I understood Judson personally, consciously dealt with it, was his, as Francis Wayland said, his pervasive heavenly mindedness. It was the one point of his spirituality that Wayland said permeated all of his writings. And I would agree, generally speaking. I think one of the most obvious features of his ongoing spirituality was his heavenly minded longing for home, and his trust that all of this is, Romans 8:28, God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. His confidence that God is going to make good on all his promises. If he weren't so heavenly minded, if he didn't believe that God was going to reward all the, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4, the deeds done in darkness, that from God we will receive our commendation, not condemnation, but commendation. I think if he hadn't had that sweet, deep trust in God's kindness to make good on all of those little sacrifices, I don't know if he would have made it. But that's the one thing I think, if you want one takeaway, it's a pilgrim mindset and a heart that is just taken with the promises of heaven. That's, I think, what got him through. And he would constantly look forward to, the crystal sea, walking with Jesus, seeing his deceased family members reunited and surrounded by many Burmese martyrs and others as well. So I would say that is probably what helped him the most.
Well, all throughout this episode, we've been hearing about the spirituality of Adoniram Judson. And so if our listeners wanted to read his works and get to know a glimpse of this man, like you have spent a lot of time profiting from him, what are some of the most pertinent letters or works that he wrote that you would suggest that our listeners would take up and read if they want to know a little bit about him from his own pen?
Yeah. So, frankly, probably the easiest entry point into it is my book, A Supreme Desire to Please Him, because what I tried to do, I tried to let Judson speak for himself. So I distilled a lot of his writings into the most pertinent parts and categorized them. So if you just want an easy entry point, definitely pick up my book. And I've footnoted everything. I've got lots of research in it. So if you wanted to follow little tributaries along the way to other resources, you can. But the only reason I say that is because there's a lot of his stuff out there is impossible to find because it's not published. I have it on my computer. Someday I'll probably do his complete critical works. It's not on my list of things to do at the moment, but I will do it someday. I have publishers who are interested in it. But so there's some stuff you wouldn't know is even in existence. But if you do want to read some things he's written, his book on baptism is in open source, so you can find that on Google Books. You can get it on Amazon in a PDF, or you can buy it. That's a great little book on believers' baptism. And the other ways to get to his actual writings were, if you get Francis Wayland's 2-volume biography, he has in there a lot of his writings. And the only other biography written that might have those writings and or additional writings that Wayland doesn't have is by his son, Edward Judson. Edward wrote another 1-volume biography on Judson that was from a son's perspective. Also, just a lot of overlap with Wayland's. He probably used some of Wayland's biography for his own biography of his dad. But Edward Judson, the 1-volume, and Francis Wayland, the 2-volume, have, generally speaking, the easiest accessibility to Adoniram's own writings himself. in addition to the book on baptism. But other than that, if you want easy snapshots and extracted quotes and stuff that give you kind of cut through a lot of the stuff that is hard to wade through, definitely pick up my book.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, especially because one of my questions was that we wanted to know biographical works about Judson or other secondary resources. So maybe if you have anything else to say about your book that you would like our audience to know, you could tell our audience. And then in addition to your book, what are some other works about Judson that you would recommend to our audience?
Yeah, so there's just, like I said, there hasn't been many. Some are so obscure and obtuse, often some sort of catalog of, somebody's THM thesis on something about linguistics related to Judson. But like I said, there's mostly 99% of the stuff about him are all biographical, and they all say the same thing more or less. And so if you just want to read a biography, you got to read Courtney Anderson's biography. I mean, I know even one of my PhD supervisors said it was, and he's a historian, he said it was the best Christian biography he'd ever read because it combines all those features I mentioned. I know other guys who, very, very influenced, that they said if they could be on a desert island with one biography, it would be Judson's biography by Courtney Anderson. So I can't plug that book enough. As far as other works, the only other work that's kind of out there that's sort of, accessible to the general public, that's, like I said, not some sort of just academic THM thesis sitting in the back of the library, is it's a short little volume edited by Jason Juicing down at Midwestern. Dr. Juicing did a great job combining different contributors to contribute different features of Judson's thought and life. So it's kind of one of those short little snapshots into the kind of the ideas, the theology, and the life of Adoniram Judson, and some really good contributions there in those chapters. It's if you read my book, Dr. Juicing's book, and Courtney Anderson's book, I would say that's probably the best three you could get that give you a good access point to Judson.
Well, Dr. Burns, I've thoroughly enjoyed our time together talking about the saint of old. And as we draw our conversation to an end now, I want to ask just two concluding questions. And they are, what final encouragements do you have about Judson, and why is he important in our telling of Baptist history?
I would just say, and the people in Judson's day even struggled with this. When he came back to Boston in 1847 for his short little home assignment, he was welcomed with a hero's welcome. And back in the then 19th century, one of the popular types of literature was called hero stories or like hero biographies. And so he was one of those. He was kind of lumped in with this historiographical sort of legendary storytelling. And as with some stories, biographies become stories and stories become legends. And in a way, his story is legendary because it's such a unique story. And some missionaries experience a fraction of the things he experiences, but so much of his life combines so many interesting features of God's providence. But I just would say Jetson was just an ordinary man, kind of quirky, big-hearted, very talented, certainly a sinner, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. He was just an ordinary man that served an extraordinary God who wanted to do something extraordinary through the means of the written word. Jetson was not a rock star. He was not a super saint as we might think. He certainly he was unique. Even people who knew him knew he was unique, and that God's hand was uniquely on his life in a very profound way. I mean, even his contemporaries would admit that in their own letters. But he's just an ordinary man, carried along by the means of grace, by a sovereign God. And so people can be encouraged just to know that it's the Lord who does it, not us. He always does it in spite of us, not because of us. And at the end of the day, it's all about Christ anyways. Jetson would say, let my name perish into oblivion. I don't want people to remember me. I want them to remember my Savior, that he died for the sins of the nations. And for Baptist history and Baptist theology in particular, I would say Judson combined some of the best of Baptist history in the sense that he was what you might call a particular Baptist. He believed in the doctrines of grace. He was a man who believed in evangelism and credo baptism and discipleship. But the one contribution he made that was it wasn't unique to him, because there was others like Fuller and Carey that were the same way, but very distinct was his, like I mentioned multiple times, his commitment to the written word, to translating and proclaiming the written word. Just if you can learn anything from him, just know that what made him a Baptist and what kept him a Christian was his submission and yielded spirit to the written word of God. That was the determinative factor in his spirituality and in his theology, was his commitment to thus saith the Lord. So I would just offer those couple insights into how he can instruct us today as both Christians and Baptists.
Amen. Dr. Burns, I want to especially thank you for taking the time to come on and have this conversation with us, and being accommodating to us and rescheduling so that way we could have this conversation. Thank you for your graciousness to give us your time, and really appreciate you and the work that you've done on Adoniram. Thank you so much today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great being here with you.
And to our listeners, we will link to the show note, or in the show notes, to Dr. Burns' book, and perhaps some of the places that he alluded to on Google Books where you could read some things by Adoniram Judson. We hope that this conversation has been profitable. And until next time, we want to wish you grace and peace.
For additional content, check out our blog ministry at covenantconfessions.com. Also, keep up with our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Lastly, thank you for listening to the Covenant Podcast. Grace and peace to you.